Stories 1. I was a trucker for about 15 years before I finally quit. I've seen my fair share of weirdness on the road, strange hitchhikers, phantom cars appearing in my rearview mirror, even lights in the sky I couldn't explain. But nothing ever stuck with me quite like what happened at that diner in Arizona. It was the summer of 2012, and I was running a long haul from California to Texas. The desert heat was brutal even at night, and my AC had started acting up. Somewhere past Tucson, I spotted an old-school neon sign blinking in the distance, Edna's Diner, open 24/7. Now, here's the thing, I've driven that route plenty of times before, and I don't remember ever seeing a diner out there. But at the time, I was running on fumes and desperate for coffee, so I didn't question it. I pulled into the dusty lot, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place looked like something out of a 1950s postcard, chrome-trimmed windows, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with swiveling stools. The neon above flickered slightly, buzzing in the night air. When I stepped inside, the smell of fresh coffee and griddle grease hit me immediately. A single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down a glass. She was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, with short, curled gray hair and tired eyes. "Take a seat, Han," she said, her voice warm but distant. I slid into a booth by the window, glancing around. The place was empty except for one other customer, a man sitting at the counter with his back to me. He wore a dark suit, which seemed odd for a place like this. He didn't touch his coffee, didn't move at all. The waitress came over and poured me a cup before I even ordered. "Passing through?" she asked. "Yeah. Didn't think there were any diners out this way," I said, taking a sip. The coffee was hot but tasteless, like water that had just barely met a bean. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We're always here when folks need us." Something about the way she said that made me uneasy. Then, the man at the counter moved. Not much, just a slight tilt of his head. Enough that I caught a glimpse of his face in the reflection of the napkin dispenser. And that's when my stomach turned to ice. His face was wrong. It was pale, too pale, like wax or something plastic. His features were stretched somehow, his eyes too wide, his mouth too narrow. And he was staring straight at me in the reflection, even though his head was still turned away. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. The air in the diner felt suddenly heavy, like I was underwater. I forced myself to look away, pretending I hadn't noticed. The waitress set down a plate in front of me, eggs, bacon, toast. I hadn't ordered anything, but she smiled again. "On the house, sweetheart." I wasn't hungry anymore. I risked another glance at the man in the counter's reflection. His mouth was moving now, whispering something. But I couldn't hear a damn thing. And then, just as I was about to stand up and get the hell out of there, he turned around and I froze as the man at the counter finally turned to face me. His skin was smooth and stretched too tight over his skull, like a mannequin left out in the sun for too long. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and glassy, almost reflective, like he wasn't looking at me, but through me. His mouth moved, and this time, I heard him. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was dry, hollow, like wine through dead leaves. The waitress's hand landed on my shoulder, startling me so bad I nearly knocked over my coffee. "Eat up, Han," she said softly, like nothing was wrong. The man at the counter hadn't touched his food. He just sat there, still as death, those glassy eyes fixed on me. Something in my gut told me to leave. Right then and there. I cleared my throat, forced a smile. Actually, I should get back on the road. The waitress's fingers dug into my shoulder, just enough to make me stop. "Storm's coming," she said. "Might want to sit a spell." I glanced out the window. The sky was clear. A full moon hung above the desert, bathing everything in silver light. Not a single cloud. When I looked back, the man at the counter was standing. I didn't hear him move, he was just up, towering over me, impossibly tall. He tilted his head. "They don't like it when you leave early." My stomach twisted. "Who's they?" I asked before I could stop myself. The waitress squeezed my shoulder one last time before letting go. "Finish your meal, sweetheart." I looked down. The eggs were rotting. Dark green and black mold spread across the plate, the bacon twisted with veins of something gray. The toast had wriggling things inside it. I shot out of the booth so fast my knees banged against the table. The whole place felt wrong, the air thick like old oil, the lights humming louder than before. The man at the counter just smiled. "They're watching now." I turned toward the door, but the neon sign outside was flickering wildly. The glass of the windows had gone dark, no reflection, no outside world, just blackness, stretching forever. I wasn't in Arizona anymore. I wasn't anywhere anymore. My breath came fast, shallow. I wasn't in control anymore, my body was screaming at me to run, but where? The diner wasn't in the desert anymore. There were no roads, no stars, no sky. Just the thick, consuming blackness pressing against the glass. The waitress moved first. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, silver key. It was old, rusted, like it had been buried for years. "Take this," she said, sliding it across the counter toward me. I didn't move. The man at the counter let out a slow, rattling exhale. Too late. The lights flickered. The walls groaned, stretching, warping like the diner was breathing. The blackness outside shifted, not empty anymore. Shapes moved within it, pressing against the glass, long fingers, too many eyes, grinning mouths that weren't really mouths at all. I reached for the key. "Don't," the man said. I grabbed it anyway. The second my fingers wrapped around the metal, the diner lurched. The floor buckled, the windows cracked. The blackness outside swelled forward like it was alive, spilling in through the cracks. The waitress's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw fear. "Run, Han." I turned toward the door, but it wasn't there anymore, just a wall where it had been. The man at the counter took a step toward me, his body jerking like a broken puppet. His grin widened, stretching past what was humanly possible. "This is where you live now." Something pounded against the windows, the walls, the ceiling. The whole diner shook. I don't remember thinking. I don't remember deciding. I just ran. I bolted toward the kitchen, the silver key clutched tight in my fist. Behind me, the man at the counter laughed, a sound too deep, too distorted, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. The kitchen door slammed shut behind me. The back door of the diner was there, waiting. I shoved the key into the lock, turned it. And everything collapsed. I don't know what happened next. I woke up in my truck, parked on the side of the highway. The sun was rising, my coffee was cold, and my hands were still clutching that silver key. I checked my GPS. There was no diner. There never had been. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone down an empty stretch of road, I see a neon sign flickering in the distance. Edna's Diner, open 24/7. And I keep driving. I never stop. Not ever again. Stories 2. I used to work the graveyard shift at a small roadside diner in Montana. Nothing fancy, just a greasy spoon off Highway 89 that mostly catered to truckers and night owls. We had the usual late-night regulars, old-timers drinking black coffee, drifters looking for a cheap meal, the occasional runaway kid trying to keep warm. But then there were the other regulars. I first noticed them about 2 months into the job. Always past midnight. Always sitting in the farthest booth. A man and a woman. The man wore a suit, too nice for a place like this. Black, pressed, not a single wrinkle. His face was pale, too smooth, like a mannequin brought to life. He never blinked. Never spoke. The woman was worse. She had long black hair that never moved, even when the ceiling fan spun lazily overhead. Her lips were too red. Like painted on red. And she always smiled. Even when she wasn't eating, even when no one was talking to her. That same frozen smile. They never ordered anything except the midnight special. Here's the thing, we didn't have a midnight special. Didn't matter who was working, whenever they came in, the cook would nod, walk into the kitchen, and come out 5 minutes later with 2 identical plates. Raw meat. Cold, dripping. I asked my manager once what the hell was going on. She just shook her head. Best you don't ask, hon, just take their plates, keep your head down, and never look them in the eye. That should have been enough. It really should have. But then, one night, I got curious. And I broke the only rule that mattered. I looked that I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the way the woman's frozen smile never twitched, not even once. Or maybe it was the fact that, every single night, the raw meat they ordered never left the plate. They never ate it. They never even touched the forks. They just sat there, staring at each other across the table, the man's too smooth face motionless, the woman's too red lips curved in that same unnatural smile. So that night, after the cook set their plates down, I lingered. Just for a second. Just long enough to let my eyes flick downward. To see what was really on those plates. It wasn't meat. Not really. It moved. Just slightly, like something breathing. The surface twitched, tiny spasms, almost like a pulse beating just under the raw, wet skin. And then, the woman turned her head toward me. Her eyes locked onto mine. And she stopped smiling. I couldn't move. The man's head tilted, too smooth skin stretching in a way that shouldn't have been possible. His lips barely parted, and in a voice dry as paper, he whispered. You see it now. I stumbled backward, my throat closing up. The air felt thick, syrupy. The world around me swam, colors dulling. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, but I couldn't look away from their faces, empty, pale, wrong. Then the woman opened her mouth. And she didn't have a tongue. She had something else. I saw it just for a second, something long, dark, squirming. And then the cook grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the kitchen. Go, he hissed, his grip iron strong. Now. I barely heard the words. My ears were ringing. The woman's mouth was still open, still showing me that thing coiled where her tongue should be. The man's glassy eyes never left me. I turned and ran. The last thing I heard before the kitchen doors slammed shut behind me was the sound of wet chewing. And this time, they were eating that I hit the kitchen floor, my legs giving out beneath me. The cook locked the door behind us, his breathing slow and steady, like he'd done this before. They saw you, he said. I could barely speak. What the hell are they? He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed something from the shelf above the fryer, a rusted bell, the kind you'd see on an old hotel counter. He held it out to me. When you go back out there, he said, set this on their table and ring it once. Then walk away. Don't look at them. Don't listen. And don't stop moving. I shook my head. I'm not going back out there. The cook's jaw tightened. If you don't, he said, you won't make it out of here. The lights flickered. A sound, low and wet, like something dragging itself across tile, echoed from the dining area. I swallowed, took the bell, and stepped back through the swinging door. The diner had changed. The booths were empty, but the seats were still indented, like something had been sitting there just seconds before. The lights overhead buzzed, flickering in and out, casting long, shifting shadows along the checkered floor. But the worst part was that the front door was gone. The windows were black, the outside world erased completely. And the only thing left in that impossible space was them. The man and the woman sat motionless in their booth, hands folded neatly on the table, their untouched plates still bleeding onto the white ceramic. They were waiting. For me. My fingers tightened around the bell as I stepped forward. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to scream, to do anything but this. But I did what the cook told me. I set the bell down. And I rang it once. The sound rang out, sharp, metallic, cutting through the air like a blade. The man twitched. His head jerked, too fast, too sudden, and his lips split apart, revealing something black and writhing beneath his gums. The woman tilted her head, her too red mouth curving back into that unnatural smile. And then the lights went out. I didn't stop moving. I turned. Walked straight for where the door should have been, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I felt something pressing in around me, something cold, wet, wrong. A voice whispered from the darkness, too many layers, too many mouths speaking at once. Come back. I kept walking. My hands hit the door. And suddenly, I was outside. It was morning. The diner behind me was quiet, still. The neon sign above flickered weakly in the rising sun. Midnight special, open late. I turned back. And the windows were empty. No man. No woman. No cook. Just a single, rusted bell sitting on the counter, covered in something dark and dripping. I got in my car and never looked back. I don't know what that place was. I don't know if it's still there. But sometimes, late at night, when I pass an old roadside diner with flickering neon, I swear I can still hear the sound of that bell. Stories 3. I worked the night shift at a little 24-hour diner just off I-70 in Kansas. One of those places that never closes, never changes, just sits there like a relic of another time. It had the usual crowd, truckers, insomniacs, drunks trying to sober up. And then there was the man at table 6. He came in every night. Exactly at 3:15 a.m. Always sat at the same booth, hands folded neatly on the table. He never spoke, never looked at a menu. Just sat there, waiting. And every night, without fail, our cook, Marlene, would come out from the kitchen, nod at him, and bring him the same meal. A black coffee. 2 eggs, over easy. 3 strips of bacon. And a slice of raw, uncooked steak. I asked Marlene about it once. She just shook her head. Don't ask, honey. But who is he? I pressed. She wiped her hands on a towel and turned to face me, her voice lowering. He's been coming here longer than I've worked here. I frowned. And how long is that? Marlene's eyes darkened. 32 years. I laughed, waiting for her to tell me she was joking. But she didn't. She just turned and went back to the kitchen. That night, when 3:15 a.m. rolled around, I did something stupid. I walked over to table 6. And I asked the man, "Who are you?" For the first time in 3 decades, he looked up. And he smiled. His smile was all wrong. Too wide. Too full of teeth. Something about his face stretched in a way that skin and bone shouldn't. Like it was trying to remember how human expressions worked. And then, for the first time ever, he spoke. "Would you like to know?" His voice wasn't what I expected. It wasn't deep or gravelly, it was soft, polite, almost pleasant. Like a voice you'd hear on an old-timey radio show. I couldn't move. The diner around us felt wrong, like the air had thickened, pushing against my skin. The hum of the old fluorescent lights above faded into silence. I could feel Marlene watching me from the kitchen pass-through. I didn't dare look at her. I swallowed. My throat was dry. "What do you mean?" The man at table 6 picked up his fork. Turned it slowly between his fingers. "I mean," he said, tilting his head, "if you really want to know. I can show you." The air grew colder. The black coffee in front of him stopped steaming. Something scratched at the windows, but when I looked, there was nothing outside. Just the highway stretching on forever, empty and endless. I took a step back. I should get back to work. The man smiled wider. "Oh, but you already asked," he said. "And I do hate to leave a question unanswered." And then he reached for the raw steak on his plate. His fingers sank into it, pressing through the muscle like it was soft as clay. I watched, frozen, as he peeled it open, not like meat, not like something you'd eat. But like a door. And on the other side, there was something waiting. Something watching. Something smiling back. The lights flickered violently. And for just 1 second, I saw what he really was, that I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. Because what I saw inside that split-open piece of raw steak was looking back at me. It wasn't a hole, not exactly. More like a window. A view into something else. Something alive. The thing inside wasn't human. It wasn't even trying to be. It had too many eyes, too many mouths, stacked on top of each other, layered like some inside-out mistake of flesh. And every one of those mouths was smiling. The man at table 6 tilted his head, watching me. "Do you see it now?" The mouths inside the steak opened. And I heard them. Whispers. Thick, wet, sliding through my brain like they were trying to get inside. My vision blurred. The air throbbed, pulsing like something was breathing around me. I felt something move behind me. Marlene. She grabbed my wrist, yanking me backward so hard my feet left the ground. The moment her skin touched mine, the diner snapped back. The whispers stopped. The air was normal again. The lights hummed. The sounds of distant highway traffic returned. I gasped, stumbling into the counter. The man at table 6 was gone. So was his plate. Marlene turned me around, gripping my shoulders, her face pale with fury. "You stupid, stupid girl." I tried to speak, but my throat felt raw. She shoved something into my hand. A knife. I stared at her, confused. What? "He'll be back," she said, voice deadly serious. "And next time, he'll be hungry." I haven't been back to that diner since. But sometimes, when I pass an old roadside joint, I can't help but look inside. Because I know, somewhere out there, a man in a suit is sitting at table 6. Waiting for someone to ask the wrong question.